Welcome back to the Investment Association. At a momentous time, a new government has been elected on a very specific mandate of change. After 14 years out of office, Labour are back and have the opportunity, with the size of their majority, to shape things for a significant period of time. As that once-in-a-generation AI policy comes to a conclusion, how will Labour seek to harness the opportunities and manage the risks presented by artificial intelligence? Now, this episode follows on from our webinar with McFarlane's last week on the expectations of a Labour government across the suite of policy areas affecting the investment sector, which, if you missed it, is still available on our website to listen back to. Now, we were close to having a Labour representative on this AI podcast, but understandably, once the election was called, they didn't have the capacity to do so. Now, we'd love to have them on a future episode, but until then, we're going to have to provide our own best estimate of what might come next. So therefore, this episode will contain opinion and informed predictions that are not necessarily Labour policy, but we're going to try our best on a best efforts basis. And we have therefore turned the tables on our usual presenter, James King, who is now in the interviewee's chair to take us through the previous government's policy, what we now know of Labour's intentions on AI that may change that, and also some thoughts on the longer term implications. So, James, great to have you with us. You're obviously the Senior Policy Advisor within the Innovation and Operations Unit. You've been working on AI for some time, have been close to the previous government's white paper. Perhaps you could provide an overview of what the government's position was in that time.
Thanks, John. Yes, I think that's definitely the right place to start, the previous government and what the direction of travel up until now has been. So around a year or so ago, we had the government's AI white paper, and the approach was to, rather than introduce legislation at that time, instead, the then UK government decided to introduce 5 high-level principles on a non-statutory basis. Mm-hmm. Those were, number 1, safety, security, and robustness. Number 2, appropriate transparency and explainability. Number 3, fairness. Number 4, accountability and governance. And then finally, number 5, contestability and redress. So all highly sensible, universally desirable principles, which I believe will, very much still apply going forward.
Okay.
And what the government essentially did with this approach was to say, okay, so here are our 5 high-level principles, and they effectively delegated to sector regulators to apply those principles within their specific domains via domain-specific rules. So for investment association members, that would mean the FCA and the Bank of England / PRA would be the most important regulators, but also other regulators would be relevant as well. And in the time since that white paper was published, and now regulators have been working away to try and apply those principles. And the previous government asked key regulators to provide a strategic update at the end of April 2024 to update the government on the progress with implementing those principles, the progress they've made on gearing up in terms of gaining the necessary people and skills that they'll need to regulate this new technology. Mm-hmm. So in the case of the FCA and the PRA, we saw those updates. And I think there was a very consistent theme that came back. And that was both of these regulators more or less saying, look, we feel that our current regulatory rules are sufficient to manage the risks presented by AI in financial services. And at this stage, there isn't necessarily the need to introduce any AI-specific rules. However, that's not to say that should the regulators start to detect any risks to their statutory objectives, of course being consumer protection, market stability, financial stability, that they wouldn't hesitate to very quickly seek to introduce rules to manage those. And it's been very clear that the regulators have been extremely keen to stay abreast of what's happening within the industry, keep their ears to the ground so that they can understand and be informed as to how the financial services industry is adopting AI and how they're looking to govern the deployment of AI and how they're looking to manage the risks as we go forward. So that's the starting point.
And I know that you've had many discussions with the FCA in terms of providing market insight to them, and the IA certainly been at the forefront of informing FCA policy in that respect. And of course, all the sector regulators will have been cognizant that a general election was coming. They might not necessarily have known when that would actually happen, and perhaps it was slightly earlier than expected. But nevertheless, from a policy perspective, a potential change of government could, of course, change the UK authorities' approach to AI regulation in the future. But now we know there is a Labour government. We know they have change as a specific mandate. What does that actually mean from an AI perspective? How much change should we expect? So perhaps you could outline what we actually know about Labour's approach here, and what have they actually said they will do in terms of AI regulation?
Certainly. Perhaps it's best to start with the mood music first, actually, and the messaging that we can see coming out of the Labour Party. Mm-hmm. So they talk about driving innovation, delivering growth, and raising productivity, and making Britain the best place to start and grow a business. And we've also seen them speak positively of the opportunities presented by AI. Yeah. So, of course, very encouraging. Also, you could say that all of these phrases would be just as at home in the Conservative Party and their messaging. Yep. So in that sense, I think the mood and the messaging is actually very consistent with what we've had up until now. And that makes sense because, of course, Labour have been very big on talking about economic growth. They've had lots of questions aimed at them around how are they going to fund their policy agenda without, big tax rises. So economic growth is clearly the way to do that. And if you think about where economic growth is going to come from, technology and innovation is a really juicy opportunity. And standing at the top of the list, artificial intelligence has got to be one of the number one technologies that everyone will be looking at to drive productivity growth across the economy going forward.
Yep.
But in terms of what they've said they'll actually do, so before the election, Keir Starmer, when referring to the previous government's AI white paper, he said that a Labour government would introduce an overarching regulatory framework that would be, quote, stronger than what the previous government had outlined in its white paper. So what is meant by the word stronger? That, of course, remains to be seen. Right. As with so much policy work, the devil is sometimes in the detail. Mm-hmm. So it's not entirely clear whether that will be perhaps an adjustment to what has up until now been the current approach, or whether that would be introduction of more horizontal AI regulation across the economy, more similar to the EU's AI Act. That perhaps remains to be seen. Probably more likely it will be the former, sort of more adjustments to the current system.
Okay.
So when we look at the manifesto and what's specifically been mentioned, well, first of all, there's a statement in there essentially saying that the regulators are currently ill-equipped to deal with AI as a fast emerging technology. Now, I'm not sure that all of the regulators would necessarily agree with such a statement. I think they've been quite quick to say that they are prepared, they are well equipped, and they're gaining the skills and expertise that they need. So that's been said. We also have this proposal to introduce a new regulatory innovation office, and this office will aim to coordinate regulators and to help them update regulation where it needs updating and to speed up the approval times. So I think in part this does sound similar to the existing Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. So it'd be interesting to see what the scope and the remit of that Regulatory Innovation Office will be when it's set up. But moving on, we've also seen in the manifesto that Labour proposed to introduce binding regulation on, I quote, a handful of companies who are developing the most powerful AI models. And it's been suggested this may take the form of some kind of licensing for big AI projects. And there's also a specific measure that's been called out in the form of banning the creation of sexually explicit deepfakes. So I think there are some parallels here with the approach being taken in the EU, so with the EU's AI Act, which introduces the most onerous requirements on the developers of AI models and, slightly less onerous requirements on the users of those AI models. So that's one parallel there. But of course, measures of this type, they probably need to be balanced against those earlier goals we mentioned about driving innovation, about competitiveness. And this is a key issue for the UK, as it is in Europe as well, because the UK and Europe are not currently the world leaders in terms of where AI companies are set up and are, working on new projects. Those places are occupied by the United States and many Asian countries. So with that being the case, I think there's going to have to be a balance struck there. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. And with measures like this as well, questions always come up about the ability of startups to comply with these types of measures and whether they might unintentionally play into the hands of established market players such as big techs who are possibly better equipped to deal with regulation than startups. So I think that will be an interesting area to keep an eye on and how that one plays out. Another interesting measure that was mentioned in the manifesto is that Labour, as part of their broader plans to shake up the planning rules in the UK, they intend to remove planning barriers to new data centers. And this is something that we've picked up on from our conversations with IA members. Going forward, as the economy becomes more and more reliant on AI and the models, this requires data centers.
Yep.
And the capacity at the moment is probably not sufficient. So new data centers are going to be necessary. So that was a really interesting point that was in there as well. But John, if you let me raise one other point, I think in this discussion about, a new UK government and what this means for AI regulation, we do probably also need to mention what's perhaps the elephant in the room, which is the EU's AI Act. Mm-hmm. So the EU are first out the gates. This is the world's first comprehensive AI regulation. Yep. It's coming in. And in a similar way to GDPR, it has very wide extraterritorial reach, and it will reach outside the borders of the EU. And for a very global industry like the investment management industry, I think it's becoming very clear that in practice, realistically, UK-based investment managers are going to have to comply with the EU AI Act. And that's just the reality of the situation. So, I mean, that's something that we all need to keep in mind as we go forward and UK's regulatory approach to AI starts to take shape. That's a very important factor.
And of course, there's been lots of discussion about how Labour might seek a slightly different relationship with the EU, and this might be an area in which they seek to perhaps become a little bit more aligned than the previous government was. So it sounds from what you've said there in terms of what's been explicitly stated by the Labour Party in their manifesto and their plan for financial services that Labour will take a slightly different course, but it's not an about turn. It's not a complete U-turn on where things were before. Reading between the lines though, what would be your overall predictions for where they take AI regulation in the future?
Well, I agree. I don't believe that we'll get dramatic change, but there will probably be a greater emphasis towards some of the risks and the harms that could unfold as a result of greater AI adoption across the economy. And I think the Labour Party would naturally be very concerned about the potential for AI to disrupt the labour market, job losses, job replacement because of AI. I think that's something that the Labour Party will be very focused on. And similarly, consumer harm and consumer protection, I think, will be high on the agenda. And that's, of course, very relevant to the FCA. And I think were we to see any instances where AI has led to real tangible harm in society, then I would expect that would provoke a political reaction very quickly. And I think in keeping with what you said about alignment with the EU's approach, we're possibly going to see, where we do see more rules and regulation around AI, those will probably be targeted more towards those entities that are developing the AI models,
yes,
perhaps more so than those who are using them.
Yep.
However, I think the issue to keep an eye on there will be where the line is drawn between who's an AI developer and who's an AI user. And this question is also coming up with the EU's AI Act. So, for example, if you're an organization who takes an AI model off the shelf, but you modify it heavily for your business purpose, and you start to refine it and turn it into something else, it's very highly customized. Does that make you an AI producer now rather than a user? It's a bit of an open question. So that's something to keep an eye on going forward. So overall, I wouldn't necessarily expect a dramatic change, but we may see some subtle changes along these lines.
So investment firms looking at implementing, we know many of them are, no immediate need to halt or change their particular approach, but nevertheless, certainly need to be aware of potential changes in UK authority approach here. James, that was fantastic. Certainly lots of exciting times ahead. Be worthwhile members staying abreast of those changes, and where better to do so than through this podcast or in discussions with you. So we'll look out for further information from yourself in due course. No doubt Labour has a number of different things that it wants to do. AI might not necessarily be something they'll do in the first week, but we'll certainly keep members up to date as this develops. Please do join us for the next episode, which will be coming out shortly. We'll be hearing from one of our colleagues on recent research on the AI use within the industry. But for now, thank you for joining us, and we'll speak to you again next time.